Everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted and honored as always to have Dr. Brian McVeigh back, and he is writing a book on applying Julian Jaynes' ideas to personal growth and psychotherapy. So he's taking different parts of that book and talking about it to us as a preview before the book comes out. So welcome, Brian. The floor is all yours.
So let me begin by saying that today's podcast, like some of my other discussions, really are attempts to lay the foundations for my project on how to develop a Jaynesian psychotherapeutics. So some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Jaynes. You've heard me talk before. You may have read his book. Some of the things I say, if you're not very familiar with Jaynes, may not be very clear. And if that's the case, please feel free to ask for clarification, because I know that we all enter a body of knowledge from different angles and at different levels. So please don't feel that this is over your head or doesn't make much sense. Always keep in mind that we're in this journey together. So in any
folks,
case,
let me remind folks of one thing. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to be I'm going to pretend to be the advocate for all of the audience during the presentation. And with every slide, I will ask questions just to make sure that as best as I can tell, both the audience here and the people watching it on the YouTube will be able to come along with us. And at the end of the presentation, you'll get to ask any questions that you have. If you have questions, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, and I will try to incorporate them into the presentations as we go along, okay? Always put an exclamation mark before the question so I can separate it out from everything else. Go ahead, Brian.
Okay, good. Yes, thank you, Shrikant, for that. I think that that way of doing things will be very helpful. So this discussion today, it's about the relationship between mind, or you might say psychology, and time. So that's sort of an abstract place to begin. And what I'm going to try and do is make things a little more specific. So really, when we talk about the relationship between time and psychology, we're talking, of course, about change. And in the psychotherapeutic literature and psychotherapeutic treatments, the whole concept of change really is crucial. And basically, that's what it's all about. I mean, that's why people come into a session, because they want to know how to change or figure out on their own how they should change themselves, how there should be some what they call self-change. What happens, I think, in the psychotherapeutic literature in the field of counseling is the word change becomes a bit insipid and vague because we hear it so often. And so what we have to do is be a little more careful in what we mean by change. Why is change important? And basically, change is about working toward a goal. It's about working toward some sort of achievement. It's about getting rid of the things, you might say, that are in your way of becoming a better person, that are hindering your self-improvement. So typically, for those of you who work in the mental health field, you'll know that when a client or patient comes in to see you, one of the things you have to do is develop a treatment plan. And one place I worked at, they had this model of a treatment plan. So it was PGOI. So P would be whatever the problem was, whatever the presenting issues were. And then G would be the goals, what the client would want to be working on to change. And then O would be the objectives. How exactly are you going to achieve those goals? And then I would be something even more specific, to interventions. So in any case, I just mentioned that to sort of put a little more flesh on the bones, if you will, of what we mean by change and why it's so important in counseling and psychotherapy. So Let me begin with another sort of abstract claim or statement. I think we have to view the mind as something that is always adjusting, accommodating, adopting resources from outside itself to renovate and expand its capabilities. And this occurs over millions of years, perhaps, if you look at the evolutionary record, but it can also happen, it does also happen within the lifespan of the individual. So this idea of adaptation, I think, is really crucial. And in today's talk, when we think of time, we also want to be thinking about at the same time adaptation as a foundational premise. One thing I would say is when we think of mind, we think often we think of mind as being in a place. We think of mind as using the space around itself also in order to absorb energy. I mean, the mind is still attached to the body, right? And in order to function, the mind as not just a neurological entity, it's also a bodily, a physiological entity. So it has to rely on resources. And so when we think of mind, when we think of the resources of the mind, we think of space, energy. But my claim today, and this is sort of a very philosophical way to look at things, I think we should view time as a resource for the mind, that the mind lives off of time. And that is how the mind improves, by going through a trajectory, whether it's on a grand evolutionary scale or during the lifespan of a single individual. So just to reiterate that, and that's something, again, it's a bit abstract, but we can return to that theme again, this idea that time is a resource that the mind needs. And to perhaps be a little more specific, to give an example, think of the idea of the future, how powerful the future is for societies and for the individual for that matter, how we play out plans, how we play out potential behaviors in our minds in the future. So that's just one example of what I mean when I say that the mind is time is a resource for the mind, because time allows us to be hypothetical. And being human, I think, unlike animals, is really about being hypothetical. How can I look forward, learn from the past, move on, and change myself? And really, that's what counseling itself is all about. It's about moving through time. It's about dealing with the past, perhaps trauma, resentments from the past. It's also about dealing with anxieties about the future, worries about the future, what's going to happen. So mind is a moving target. Its complexity is due to its temporal nature, constantly updating, interacting, goal-directed, future-directed. So its very nature has to do with time, not just spatiality, as I already mentioned. And its transformability allows great neurocultural plasticity. So here we're becoming a little more specific in the discussion. We're talking about what is usually called neuroplasticity or neurological plasticity, but I prefer the term neurocultural plasticity. And we can talk about that later perhaps, but just to mention why I think it's important to phrase it that way is because the mind is not just about neurology. The mind is also about what we learn, how we're socialized, how we are enculturated in a specific period and place. So the cultural side is just as important as the neurological side. And both sides, of course, are very plastic. In fact, you could say that neurological plasticity and cultural plasticity actually inform each other and produce this very powerful thing that we refer to as the mind. So if you look at the graphic here, this is sort of interesting. I just pulled this off the internet. So if you look at the year 1900, books, plays, journals, and you can see the wiring of the mind, the brain using different colors as this you're looking inside a computer, and then the wiring becomes a little bit different, a little more complicated as new technologies are introduced, television, radio, movies. And then of course, um, um, the video games, computers, Walkmans by 1980, the wiring changes again, and then email, texting, internet, and then of course, social media, smartphones. And so this is, we're only looking at about a century here of the rewiring of the human mind. And so if you think about what other types of transformations the mind has experienced over the millennia, of course, you can see the great complexity of neurocultural plasticity. So I think that sort of illustrates the point I'm trying to make. So changes in psyche. So as I've already said, adaptation unfolds across different temporal spans.
Brian, let me go ahead and summarize three things. I mean, you've said three things so far. One is that whenever we're talking about psychotherapy, we're talking about change, kind of adaptation, which implicitly or explicitly requires a goal or a purpose. So it is something. So that's one large point you made. The second large point is thinking of time as a resource for the mind, that anything that mind needs to do will require time to kind of work on it, to kind of produce it. And even the concept of future itself presupposes that. The third point that you made is a very complex point, because what you're saying is that the mind at different times across history is different. And because of the media consumption of it, the way in which it works, what its potentialities are different. And we should keep that in our mind when we are looking at this issue. Is that fair way of summarizing it so far?
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for that. You hit all the key points. And to get back just to mention it again, this idea of viewing time as a resource for the mind. We don't usually think that way. It's kind of an odd way to put it, but I think we could make the argument that the mind feeds off of time in the same way that the mind is grounded in and feeds off the environment, off the body, nutrients, whatever. The mind also, in a way that we have to appreciate, is plugged into time. And so, in any case,
yeah, I just want to say one thing as an aside. You know, when I studied these great books and great ideas, which identifies as 103 great ideas, I was astonished. There are two ideas that really stumped me, that looked very simple, but were enormously complex. One was language, and second was time. So time seems like a simple idea, but it is very profound. And so, so we are in for a treat here. Go ahead, Brian.
Okay, no, thank you. Yeah, so what I want to do going forward is look at what I call 5 time scales that in each in their own way shape, configure, condition the mind or psyche. And the first 2 or 3 time scales actually we're pretty familiar with. I think there's been a lot of psychological research with these time scales, so there's nothing very unusual here. But I think it's a good place to start. So the first time scale, bioevolutionary adaptations. So, of course, as I said, this has been researched by evolutionary psychologists. Usually they look at anatomy, genetics, and there's this time scale has a very scientific, a hard-nosed scientific feel to it. And I think for that reason, many people are attracted to claims that are made by evolutionary psychologists because it seems so scientific. The arguments are either supported or not supported by the record. But with that said, I think there is sort of a weakness or a problem sometimes with some of the claims made by evolutionary psychologists. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, so I have to be a bit careful what I say today. But I think one of the weaknesses is that despite some of the fascinating findings that they have come up with, they sometimes they work under this assumption that basically the human mind, even though it has evolved, in some ways it has not really changed. In other words, some adaptations that we currently have, or certain traits about human psychology, were shaped by evolutionary forces 500,000 or 1,000,000, 2,000,000 years ago, and then the mind just stopped changing. It basically stopped evolving. And so therefore we can explain modern current behavior by looking in the past. And I think that that is a mistaken view. I think that the mind was never designed just to be fit or just to adapt to one prehistoric period. I think that the mind in any century that you want to look at is somehow changed and somehow different, and that the mind is constantly trying to catch up with environmental changes, with social complexity, whatever is going on in the environment. So in any case, I'm not sure if that point is clear, but that's just one of my slight criticisms I have with evolutionary psychologists, despite some of the very important work that they have done. So the second time scale is developmental. Stages spread over an individual's lifespan. So actually, a lot of work in research psychology looks at developmental stages. And I just throw this up as an example. We don't have to talk about it, but Piaget is probably the best known, at least childhood developmentalist. There are others. In fact, I would say that probably most famous, well-known psychological researchers have looked at the time span from what we might call a developmental perspective. So beginning with Freud, right? Freud talked about psychosexual stages of development, anal, oral, phallic, genital, latent, whatever. I forget my Freud actually, but and then besides Freud, of course, there are many others who had a real understanding that at least within the lifespan of a single individual, things radically change, especially when a person is young. And so that has been recognized by psychology, of course, for a long time. There's nothing terribly revolutionary about that, as despite its importance. I'm trying to think of some other examples. Erickson, for example. Now he was different from Piaget because he looked not just at the developmental stages of a child, but also the lifespan, going from day one up until your 60s, and seeing how people change through their life. Another recent example that made some waves, Kohlberg talked about moral development of the individual. So there are many examples. So in any case, this is like bioevolutionary psychology, this idea of, actually, I shouldn't say developmental, I think lifespan is a more accurate description. That type of angle, that type of research has been very salient in psychological studies. Another time scale, a little more difficult to pin down, I think a little more difficult to describe, but we might attempt to call it the mind's ability to self-correct when navigating day-to-day challenges. So there's been a lot of work in, perception, for example, moment by moment, how the mind adapts to its environment, how vision is processed, how hearing is processed, and maybe day to day, certainly within a clinical setting, you might see someone change day to day if they're having some sort of problem. So again, like I said, the third time scale is a little more difficult to come up with some clear-cut examples, but I think that it does deserve mentioning, because the mind is changing, not just year by year, not just through different periods of a person's life, but really second by second. And I just read a fascinating article about how some neuroscientists did some research, and they were very surprised to discover that it's a little difficult to explain without having the article in front of me, but I'll try anyways. It's very mysterious, because the assumption that neuroscientists have had is that when an organism has an experience, that experience is patterned, or somehow it changes, it's represented in neurological connections, the connections between the neurons. But what they discovered is that that's not always true, and that you still have a representation floating around in the mind, but somehow that representation has detached itself from those neuronal connections. Now, that's probably not a very clear, articulate way to express it, but in any case, I think the reason why I bring it up is because it shows us how we really don't understand. We're really at the beginning stages of trying to understand how neurology relates to mental representations, and how neurology relates to culture, and how it relates to this constant flood of information we're getting all the time. And of course, this all goes back to today's theme, which of course is the relationship between time and psyche. So the fourth scale, the mind's resilient capacity to self-repair, overcome maladaptive behaviors when confronted by trauma, major life stressors, or mental illness. So the idea here is humans are imbued with natural innate rhythms of self-healing anyways. But what happens, sometimes we require an external support, such as a clinician or a counselor, psychotherapist, to bring us back on track and to help to jumpstart the natural reparative processes that our mind possesses. Sometimes, of course, we need medication, mental. We have to be prescribed medication. But in any case, the idea here is that quite often the mind can handle major trauma on its own. It does not necessarily need external supports or external aid to get back on track. For example, many people who experience some terrible traumatic event, only about, I think it's 10% develop PTSD. And I think what that shows us, what it indicates, is how naturally resilient the human mind is. So in any case, this is the fourth time scale. What happens when the mind, so the stressors build up, or perhaps there's some inherent neurochemical defect in an individual psyche that leads to some sort of mental breakdown, some sort of mental illness. How does time relate to that? What type of external support do we need, as I said, to jumpstart the natural reparative process? So the idea here is it's not so much that the external supports, whether it's mental health medication or a counselor, they're certainly not curing the individual's mind. They're not fixing the individual's mind. Rather, what they're doing is they're helping the natural healing processes that are there anyways. They're just jump starting them. They're just getting things back on track. Okay, so just a little more discussion on this idea. So when something overtakes our natural ability for self-healing, the obstacle transition restoration arc becomes derailed. So don't worry about what that means now. Obstacle transition restoration arc. I think later on I'll talk about that in perhaps another discussion. I just mentioned it here, but the idea is that the mind goes through cycles, and sometimes those cycles become disrupted, and things don't work the way they do. But in any case, something I will talk a little more about, this idea, what's called stages of change. So two psychologists, Prochaska and Di Clemente, developed this idea, stages of change, of how when someone comes in for counseling and they need help, the idea is to figure out, well, before we come up with a treatment, before we try to find out what's wrong with this person, let's first find out where they are on this cycle of change, if you will. And so pre-contemplation means that this person perhaps is engaging in self-denial, self-deception. They won't even admit that they have a problem. They're in denial. Contemplation is when the person starts to realize that perhaps they do have a problem. They're coming round. They're starting to listen to other people. They're starting to listen to the inner voice in their head that there is that they perhaps do have a mental illness, or perhaps they are using alcohol too much, or perhaps they are ignoring whatever problem exists in their lives. Then the third stage is preparation. So now they take the contemplation more seriously, and it's almost as if they make a decision. Okay, I know I have a problem. What am I going to do to fix that problem? And so they might seek out a psychiatrist if they need mental health medication. They might start to go to a counselor for talk therapy. They might start to repair relations with relatives or friends who have tried to help them, whatever the case may be. They're starting, and of course, and then this leads to action, where they have decided on a treatment plan. They're more focused. They are taking very seriously their care. And then, of course, maintenance. So the idea is, after there's some, if we can use the word, recovery from whatever ails them, now the individual with the clinician has to decide how to maintain a certain level of care, or perhaps cut back on certain interventions. But the idea is to make sure that the person continues down a healthy path. And then we could also throw in relapse. And this, I think, especially within the context of substance use disorder, relapse is very common. And the idea is, rather than viewing it as a failure, to view relapse, not just with substance use disorders, but I think many mental health disorders, the idea with relapse is it's not necessarily a negative. The idea here, as I said, it's just part of the cycle, and we just have to get the person back into this cycle of this circle of care, if you will. So this idea, stages of change, if anyone in the audience is familiar, if you work in the mental health field, of course, you'll know there are a couple of assessments that are used actually to measure stages of change. So when I worked at a hospital for a couple of years, we used the University of Rhode Island, University of Rhode Island inventory of change, or something like that. And in any case, anytime we did an assessment on a patient, we were required to try and figure out exactly where they were on this cycle, if you will. Well, what level, what stage of change were they at? And that would determine what type of treatment would be needed. So in any case, I'm just using this as an example to make more concrete this notion of how important time is for understanding the workings of the human mind, especially when it's trying to adapt and repair itself. So now what I'm going to talk about, in a sense, is really the point of today's talk. So far,
Brian, let me go ahead and summarize the first four for folks.
Sure.
Can you do that? Okay. So there are four stages that, four views of time that we looked at so far. One is the evolutionary time scale. And one of the criticisms of Brian is that many of the people who use that kind of look at modern life as if it was exactly like, the human beings were exactly the same at that time. So maybe that evolutionary times, at the same time, Brian thinks that there is value to that. And I certainly think that there is tremendous value to that. But I think maybe the idea of kind of evolutionary time scale plus kind of cultural evolution put on the top of that may be a way of kind of dealing with that time scale in a more realistic way. What do you think? So
Yeah.
the ideas of, Julian Jaynes, et cetera, as well as kind of how technology changes and how mind changes with it. And if you look at that, evolution plus cultural evolution as the time scale, I think that would make it fairly robust way of thinking about it. What do you think?
Yes, I think you're right. And so what we have to do is incorporate a Jaynesian perspective, because the issue with many evolutionary psychologists, when they think of adaptation or change, they're looking at anatomy or they're looking at genetics. And this is a blanket statement, perhaps unfair, but they don't really seem to take culture so seriously. Or if they do, they don't realize how powerful culture can be in changing the psyche. So culture is not just the icing on the cake. Culture is not just this thin layer. Culture actually is where the action is. That culture itself, more so than genes, can change human psychological processing. And so that's where Julian Jaynes comes in.
Perfect. So that's the first time scale. The second is the developmental time scale. We've looked at Piaget's work a lot, and I think that's very, very powerful to understand that we go through these stages in order to grow. So that's another time scale. The second time scale is kind of moment-to-moment living or day-to-day living, where you are responding to the natural requirements of life and natural variabilities of demands that is placed on you. So that's another time scale on which. And the fourth time scale, which most of the kind of psychotherapy focuses on, is dealing with self-repair or trauma, things like that. When you identify a problem, this is not something a developmental issue. This is not a evolutionary issue. This is not issue of day-to-day coping. This is some problem that you have, which is significant enough, complex enough, that you need to really work a strategy using these stages of change, perhaps with another person to work with to overcome that. So those are the four kinds that we have talked about so far. Now to the fifth. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Yes, thank you, Shrikant. Yeah, so that's a good summary. And so, as I said, today's talk really leads up to this fifth time scale. It's something that many researchers overlook. They have a hard time intellectually digesting this fifth time scale. I mean, and part of the reason is because very few people have really looked at it. I mean, Julian Jaynes is very unusual and exceptional because he looked at a major change in human psychology, but over the span of just a few generations or several centuries. And psychology right now is not intellectually equipped to take this type of approach into account. So I think it's a great failing of mainstream psychological research. The assumption that they make is that the human mind evolved, and depending on what you look at or who you ask, maybe somewhere between 100,000 to 50,000, maybe between 50 to 35,000 years ago, the human mind was set, more or less. They use the metaphor, was set in stone, and it didn't really change that much. But what Jaynes is saying, no, it did change, especially a few thousand years ago. But the change did not have to do with genetics. The change did not have to do with anatomical evolution. The change had to do with culture. And this is where not just psychologists, but I think many people have a real hard time with this notion. They have a real hard time getting their mind wrapped around the idea that culture itself can change dramatically human mentality. And of course, according to Jaynes, the reason why there was such a huge rupture in human mentality was because of growing social complexity. And this drove cultural modifications of mentality. And of course, this is a very abstract presentation on James now, but when you have to really look at the details of how he talked about how all these cultural modifications relate to language, relate to metaphors as sort of the driver for changing how people view the world and how the mind works. So like anything else, it's one thing to just come up with a sort of abstract claim, but in order to appreciate that claim, to see if there's any merit to it, we really have to dig down and we have to look at the details to see if the evidence holds. So I just mention that as sort of a caveat, because some of these claims that James made, some of the claims that I'm making today, I of course I realize sound perhaps out in left field, or perhaps they sound as if there's no evidence to support them. But I think there is a lot of evidence to support these claims. You just have to know where to look for it. So that's the fifth time scale. So why is this important? Especially, what does this have to do with the modern world, I suppose? What does this have to do with modern people? Well, actually, this is just to illustrate things a little more clearly. So James, of course, theorized about the transition from what he called the bicameral mind to conscious interiority, and this illustrates the fifth time scale. And that this illustration is taken right out of Jane's book here. And of course, this is a Mesopotamian king who was pointing to the altar. And the context is that he's very upset. And the reason why he's upset is because the god is no longer sitting in the altar telling him what to do. And of course, this is just an example of many examples from that time period that show, according to James, what happened when the bicameral mind broke down. And like I said, some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with what the bicamerality means. You may not be, you may be new to the talk, but feel free later on, of course, to ask any questions about that if it's not clear. So why is exploring the fifth temporal scale so important? Okay, that's so I'm going to wrap up the talk by addressing that. And by the way, this illustration here is from the Iliad. It's Ajax versus Hector, these two warriors fighting each other, and presumably the other two individuals standing behind them are the gods directing their behavior. And if you read the Iliad, especially if you pay attention to what was actually a more literal translation of the Iliad, that's the sense you get, of course. And this relates to the bicameral mind. And I just threw that in I thought was a really good illustration of the bicameral mind. But in any case, so the point that I'm trying to make is, if we understand the historical origins of conscious interiority. So again, just to repeat, just to be clear, James made the claim that conscious interiority is not rooted in evolutionary adaptation. It's not rooted in biological, anatomical, genetic, or the genes, right? Conscious interiority arose the same way, for example, the invention of mathematics might arise, or democracy, or some ideology. Conscious interiority is more of a cultural, more of an, it's a set of ideas about how the mind works. It is not rooted, there's nothing, quote, natural about conscious interiority. So in any case, if we understand the origins of conscious interiority, hopefully that can help us appreciate more clearly how present day recuperative mental processes operate, why they operate the way they do. So the idea here is that if we rely on a more theoretical, pure research project, like looking at the ancient world, and if we really take ancient civilizations seriously and try to understand them, then actually there are some practical clinical applications. That's quite a jump, I'll admit. What do the ancient Egyptians, ancient Mesopotamians have to do with psychotherapy? It's not clear at first blush, of course, but I do think there is a connection. So let me just zero in on on what I mean by all this. So a Jaynesian perspective helps us understand a number of things. I'll start with the last 2 points. That's the last one is why and how hypnotherapy works.
Brian, let me interrupt you for a
Sure.
second. Let me ask a couple of questions.
Sure.
Can we go ahead and stop sharing? I want to kind of have a discussion on
Okay.
the concept of time in the bicameral mind and the concept of time today.
Okay.
So let's look at the people in the bicameral times. How did they think about the time? You know, when they were hearing voices and they were just doing things.
Mhm.
So if you want to describe how did they think about time and how is it, or what is it like? Can you portray a picture of how they think about time?
In bicameral times,
Yes.
yes. So, of course, if we look at ancient civilizations, there's tremendous archaeological evidence that that they developed calendrics, astronomy, a very primitive type of astronomy that has to do with time. They did have sort of a notion of time, certainly. I mean, they were actually very sophisticated when it came to predicting the seasons and knowing when to plant. The ancient Egyptian had many words, many very specific words for to describe what we call time. And that's where it gets confusing, and I think we get tricked because then we assume, oh, they must have had the same ideas of time that we do. But I don't think they did because they're actually, it's surprising what they're missing. There's no clear sense of self-narratization in any of the literature. Um, Time was something very concrete. And James never wrote about this, but I remember talking to him once. He was trying to come up with different adjectives to describe bicameral notions of time. And he struggled, but one word that he used was full time. And full time means that you can only think about time in a very, very specific way. That there's no sense that time is something abstract with a that like an arrow that just has the past, present, and future, and goes off into infinity like space. So in the same way, the ancients probably had no notion of of infinity, of spatial infinity. They had no notion of temporal infinity, and in fact, that notion of infinity did not come much later, really. I mean, it's a little bit debatable, but certainly by the time of Newton, there was this notion that space went on forever, and therefore time could go on forever. But for the bicameral individual, for example, there's no discussion of the future, and I think that's a real clear-cut example. So, of course, they had a simple notion of the future. What's going to happen next year, tomorrow? Certainly, when they built the pyramids, there was an idea it was going to take a long time, but there was no notion of the future as being something improved or radically different. The only time that they would think of time as being different would be in the past. So they basically only had 2 versions of time, the present and the past, and only in a very concrete way. But there was,
Wow.
yeah. So again, it's a little difficult to talk about unless we give examples. But
Yeah. Let's do one thing. I'll put it in my own words. My ability to do that is nowhere near as good as yours, but let me try. In the bicameral mind, you have these 2 parts where you're actually hearing voices of God or your ancestors or something, some other being, and you are simply following them. So you're just following the orders, and the gods will tell you what to do. And so it's kind of it's a passive approach towards life. You don't really need to worry about the future because your God will tell you what you're supposed to do all along, and you just count on that. Okay. Now, the breakdown of bicameral mind is when this thing stopped working for you. Those voices no longer worked, and you were kicking and screaming, forced to create what you have, the conscious interiority, where you have to say, what would happen if I did that? And you have to kind of narratize yourself that I could do this, I could do that. What would happen? You kind of are doing a simulation in your mind. So for the first time, you're really thinking about the future. When God's talking to you or your ancestor talking to you actually worked for you, you didn't have to do that because the gods would tell you what to do and you just do that. You don't have to do it yourself. But it is the breakdown of society during that time, and this process no longer working, that people develop this ability, which is a cultural invention of conscious interiority, this mental space where you projected different things. And that's where the concept of time took a quantum leap.
Yes.
Where everybody had to be doing that because just listening to gods didn't work anymore. Is that a way of explaining it?
Yeah, that's yeah, you explained it very well. So I think another way to look at it is this idea of reactive versus proactive. So if you have if you have developed because of consciousness an as if mentality, that's very powerful, because then it opens up all these branches in the future that you can actually visualize yourself going down different roads, doing this, not doing that. So it helps with narratization. And that's really the key word here, the ability to narratize. So of course, bicameral people had a very primitive ability to narratize, but not to the extent that conscious people have. Conscious people can project, they can time travel in a way that would be inconceivable to people in bicameral times. And you know, you used the word simulation, and basically that's what it's about. And that's what I was trying to get at before when I talked about how time is a natural, not a natural, but time is a resource. Time gives us something that is very valuable that we can use. James, as I said, he talked about this idea of full time versus empty time. Empty time is a more modern notion of time, that it's abstract and that you have to put things in time to fill it up. Where in the bicameral world, there was no notion of empty time. Time was not abstract. You knew exactly where you were going to be, what you would be doing. Everything was prescribed for you. That's why actually they probably had more words for time, or to describe time, than we do in the modern world, because we have a more abstract idea of what time is.
Yeah, and the other thing I really like is to look in parallel about what is happening to the society and what is happening to our ability to think about our own lives within the society. Because if the society is very well, everything is going like you're living in a tribe of 30 people, you know everybody, the environment is kind of hardly changing, all the parameters in which it changes is known to everybody. There is the habits you have, there is a communication, understanding that you have in this entire group. The way you need to think about the future is very different than if you're living in the middle of New York, where in midst of people you don't know, and you're staying on the 11th floor of a skyscraper, and you don't even know what is needed to keep the skyscraper going, let alone the laws that are needed to kind of keep the peace, and the economic principles and systems to keep the city fed and prosperous enough that I can continue to do that. That requires a lot of thinking about people, space, and time, as opposed to, you have to think of it in an abstract way. There is no way, because the concretes are too much, too many, spread across too much space and too much time. Whereas in a tribe, like in the evolutionary context where we evolved, the number of people, 30 people, we can handle with our brains. Our brains are amazing at handling 30 people and everything that is going on with them. The physical limitations are also very, very small. And the amount of planning you have to do to keep things going is also very limited. So I think it's just a question of scale of life. And what happens that as the scale grows up, the demands of what you need to do in here to continue to function well in that scale dramatically changes. And that's what James is, I like that James always does this kind of parallel development of society change this way, and therefore in order to handle that, in order to live and thrive in that, the consciousness needed to change some way.
Right. Yes. And just an example just popped into my head. Years ago, I read something in ancient history. The Romans were at war with a Germanic tribe, and so the Germanic tribe, every day they would use the same tactics to attack the Romans. But the Romans figured out another tactic, and they envisioned themselves being able to do something different. Well, of course, so who won the battle? Of course, the Romans did, because they used time as a resource, where this particular Germanic tribe was never able to figure out, that there's let's hypothesize and think of the future and go down different routes. Instead, it was just repeating the past over and over. And so there's a real political, economic, practical implications of this idea of time. And remember, at least in the Western world, we didn't really start to use clocks until I think maybe the 12th, 13th century. And so time as we think of it, this idea of empty abstract time, even for us, is a relatively recent invention. Also just another example, when I know in Japan in the 19th century, when they started to modernize, one of the biggest problems the modernizers had, the Japanese modernizers, the leadership with their own people, with the rural peasants, was trying to get them to show up for work in factories at the same time every day for a number of years. That was a very, very foreign idea. And of course, not just in Japan. I think that same story played out in Europe too. It just happened in Japan a little bit later, perhaps, but that the same story played out, where people who were used to the natural rhythms, it was very foreign and alien to them to be expected to show up at a precise, and that's another big invention, preciseness of time. So science has made, the mind and technology time and technology are really intertwined in very complex ways. And one of the greatest things that has helped science is measuring time, being very precise. So that's why, in the English language, we talk about a foot. That, the space used to be measured with our body parts. And I think the same thing with time. It's a very physical type thing, but the modern world forces us to be very precise, right down to not the second, but the millisecond. And so you can see how a changing notion of time changes technology.
Absolutely. In India, they have a concept called Indian Standard Time. When somebody says that they're going to be at a certain place at a certain time, by Indian Standard Time, they mean that around sometime around that day or perhaps the next, I may be there. That's like the rough translation of the Indian Standard Time. All right, I think this is a good segue in order to kind of establish the kind of fundamental distinction. But please go ahead with the slideshow.
Okay, just call it up again.
So folks will come to all the questions in the Q&A. If you have a question, which is a clarificatory question, you can go ahead and put it in the chat and I'll incorporate that.
Okay. So I actually just one more slide to go. And as I was saying, this, what I'm doing now is wrapping everything up. So we looked at different time scales, and just to reiterate, the claim that I'm making is that this time scale of several centuries, perhaps just one century, has been ignored by psychologists. But we could learn so much about humanity and history if we used this fifth time scale. And certainly what James had to say makes more sense What James had to say does not make much sense unless we take into account this fifth temporal scale. And then the other point, what does this have to do with modern people? Why is this important for self-improvement, for trying to improve clinical outcomes? And that'll be the sort of conclusion of my talk today. So as I was saying a little while ago, so the question is, what can a Jaynesian perspective help us understand when we look at time using this fifth scale? Well, I would start at the bottom. Hypnotherapy, of course, is used by many clinicians. And I've talked about hypnosis a bit before. And one thing to keep in mind about hypnosis is that we know an awful lot about hypnosis, actually. It's used by many clinicians. Not always, but often it does have a positive outcome. It can be very effective. But despite all our knowledge and understanding about hypnosis, we still don't really know why it works. There's a mystery there. But of course, James has a whole chapter devoted to hypnosis. And again, he views hypnosis, when the hypnotic trance, as a vestige of the bicameral mind. So that's just one example. There are many examples, but that's just one example that James, in the way that James can shed light on how the modern mind works. We really won't understand how the modern mind works unless we look to the past. Another point on this agenda, the meaning of hallucinations in modern times. So of course, I've talked about this a lot before too, but when we hear hallucinations, we usually think there are a few wires loose in an individual's mind, but it's becoming more and more obvious, I think, that there's nothing abnormal about hallucinations themselves. Now, there are certain mental illnesses that you can characterize as being abnormal that lead to the symptoms of hallucinations, but hallucinations themselves are not necessarily a sign of psychopathology. And in fact, there is a voice hearing movement. So there are a lot of people who have not been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, non-clinical population, who experience hallucinations on a regular basis. And so what's going on there? And of course, if you read James, you'll know that he made the claim that hallucinations were really were crucial to the bicameral mentality, and that at one time hallucinations were not unusual at all, and hallucinations were a sort of a type of primitive volition. That's how people made decisions, through hallucinating supernatural visitations from gods or ancestors. So those are just a couple of things. And then if you look at the first point, the role of foci in everyday navigation, psychic healing. So foci, I think I've introduced that acronym before. Again, we can talk about this later if people are not clear what I mean by it. But foci is abbreviation for features of conscious interiority. And one of the problems I think people have with James is this whole notion of consciousness or conscious interiority, because what you have, in order to appreciate James, you have to understand, when he talked about consciousness, he meant a package of features, a package of powerful mental capabilities. And you have to be specific on what constituted that package. And so foci is just my way of highlighting the point that there is no thing called consciousness. Rather, there's a list of features. And
Brian, can we
yeah.
go ahead and summarize it very briefly? Because people who are watching the YouTube video, or some of the people who are here, may not be familiar with it. So if you could just summarize it with a minute or two, if you can.
What some features are?
Yes.
Yeah. So the most common, the most basic feature is spatialization, the ability to simulate in your mind, to have an image, that the belief that there is a space in your mind. That's a core feature of conscious interiority. Another one is some of them are a little more difficult to understand than others, but this idea of excerption, where when thoughts are crossing your mind, sort of like a stream. You can pick out different thoughts and build a story. That's called excerption. Another one is self-autonomy, this idea that you are in control of yourself, or yourself is controlling you, you might say. Um, Another one is the observing self, or the I. So to view you, so the idea is to view yourself as having two aspects. One aspect is the I, which is a sort of a observing subject, and then this other aspect of the self is the me, which is the observed object. And again, I can give examples of that later, because I know it may be a little too vague, but another feature of conscious interiority is self-reflexivity, this idea that that no other person or thing shares my me-ness. Now, that's something we take for granted, but it did not exist in bicameral times. There's no record of it, really. So that's I think sort of again, because we take it for granted, it's like the nose on our face in front of us, we actually ignore it. Other features, there's about 12 or 13 features.
I think this is good. But I think if people get just the idea of kind of the mental space where you are kind of thinking of yourself as this analog eye, narrowizing of what are the possible things you could do, and then choosing, saying, okay, this is what I will do because of this. That being able to kind of think of yourself in that mental space and project multiple courses and kind of simulating what you would do and then doing that. I think that's like the core of it. If you can get that much, I think that really separates James from everybody else.
Okay, good. Yeah, and so like I said, another podcast I'll be a little more specific on foci, how it relates to psychic or
Wonderful
psychotherapeutic healing. But so what's important here is, what is the role of foci in everyday navigation and in not necessarily very traumatic, not healing very traumatic experiences, but just dealing with daily stresses. And that's something I think for a later time we can talk about. Also related, the role of foci in anytime you have a serious mental disorder. How, and clinicians use foci all the time. They just don't necessarily give them a clear-cut name. So the argument I'm making is that I'm not proposing a new type of psychotherapy. I am not proposing a Jaynesian school or a Jaynesian system of psychotherapy. All I'm saying is that if we understand how consciousness itself operates, we can more easily help people and facilitate their own psychic healing. And in another, I'm going to talk in more detail about that later at another time, but I just want to make that point that basically, because we take conscious interiority for granted, we don't necessarily look at its different components. We don't necessarily try to understand what it means. We confuse consciousness with perception and cognition and all these things. And so we don't really have a good understanding of what it is. And we just assume that everybody has it all the time. And what happens is we overlook how actually, when the mind tries to heal itself, in many ways, it is relying on these foci. And I'll just give you one example of a very commonly used foci in clinical settings: mental imagery. Okay, so for those of you who are mental health counselors, you'll know that's a real sort of meat and potatoes. That's a commonly used technique, or you might say intervention, to help people to, for example, PTSD. You might use mental imagery for exposure, rather than going to the actual place where the disaster or trauma occurred. You, in your own office, you can have them close their eyes and envision and live through the trauma as a way to begin the processing, healing process, to have them expose themselves to it. So mental imagery is I think, a real good example of how mental imagery is an aspect of consciousness, right? And but we use it all the time to help people heal their minds. Another example, self-narratization. I mean, there's a whole therapy. There's a whole system of therapy um, uh, that uses narratization, right? It was developed in family systems therapy, but it's commonly used, this idea to picture yourself on a personal timeline, and that imagination, or that imaging of that timeline of self-narration, of course, can be used for many purposes. It can be used to rewrite your personal story. It can be used to imagine a different life, a different path that you may take. And in fact, self-narratization is, I didn't mention it before, but self-narratization is a core feature of conscious interiority. So all the point I'm making is that, like I said, there are about 12 or 13 different features of conscious interiority. They are all used by the mind, whether it's an everyday navigation through the world, or whether you come to see a mental health care provider who tries to help you. He or she will be using as interventions these features. They may not use the same language that I'm using to describe them, but I think that conscious interiority, or whatever you want to call it, subjective introspectable self-awareness, is has healing properties itself. And the idea is to cash in on those properties to help people. So the last point I'll make is the role of foci in causing mental disorders. Okay, so that's sort of an opposite argument. So I just spent a lot of time talking about how foci can be cultivated or used to help the mind heal. But anything good, there's always something bad attached. And many times, foci can work too well. They can over adapt. And an example might be self-narratization. So some people might self-narratize too much. They may go back to a past event that they're stuck on. And so the foci of self-narratization helps them do that. But in this case, it causes a lot of mental distress. Or they might have anxiety, and they might envision themselves in the future and worry too much. What's going to happen? I should have done this. Should I be doing this? That leads, of course, to anxiety disorder. And so there are other examples I could give. For example, I think a very vivid example is in PTSD. One of the core symptoms are intrusive thoughts or intrusive images. So when someone cannot get that image out of their head, it's sort of like a recording in their head of the trauma, can be very distressing, can lead to other very negative symptoms. And so what's happening there is the foci of mental imagery usually can be a positive thing, but in the case of PTSD can be a negative thing. So there are many other examples I could give, but I just wanted to show the complexity. Anytime Homo sapiens evolves, anytime we get a new trait, whether it's through biological bioevolution or whether it's through historical change, there's always a downside. And I think that's true with foci too. I just want to show the complexity of it. So in any case, I think I'll end there, and I'll be more than happy to listen to any questions that people might have.
Wonderful, folks. So it's time for Q&A. 3 people are already in the line. Let's see. So it's going to be Dan, Candice, and Phil. Folks, in order to ask questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Keep on topic, be brief. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. Dan, you're next. Give me just a second. I want to make sure you can unmute. Go ahead.
Thank you. I liked your slide about the talking about the human mind using resources outside. And that's something in Stoicism that we study. It's called externals. It's the subject of a lot of Stoic discussion, because in Stoicism, we have a dichotomy of control. We know there are a lot of things we can control, mostly our thoughts, and everything outside, thoughts of others, events, status in your community. All these things are externals that we cannot control. One of the principal teachers was Epictetus on this topic. So I'm curious how you, from a psychotherapy standpoint, what can you recommend or what can you describe about how the mind can reinforce this idea that externals are ultimately uncontrollable, even though we love to think, oh, I'm in control of my life. I know what I'm going to do today. Everything's going to go my way. But how can the mind learn the reality of it, that ultimately these externals are beyond our control?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. And so I think usually, I mean, what I do myself, I think there are different types of interventions to deal with that. But what I usually do is I assume that the person has this idea that they cannot control anything in their lives. They can't control their thoughts. They can't control what's happening to them. And what I do is I try to inject some objectivity into their worldview. And it sounds like a simple intervention, but I ask them to go home and make a list of during that day what they actually could control, what they could do, and then what they can't control. And many times what they can't control involves other people. That's you often, not always, but often it's interpersonal issues that when someone comes to talk about, I feel out of control, it's because they can't control their spouse or their children or their boss, whoever. But in any case, so the idea is to teach them that, yes, it's true. Unfortunately, in this world, let's be honest, there are many things that we cannot control. However, there are some things we can control. And so in terms of features of conscious interiority, the idea here is to encourage self-autonomy, that I am an autonomous being, and that the more objective I am in seeing what I can and can't control, the more autonomy the autonomy itself, the feeling of autonomy will increase. It doesn't mean that the loss of control will completely go away. And again, that falls under the category of acceptance, and to teach the client that you have to accept the fact that you cannot control everything. And of course, it gets a little more complicated because it depends, of course, on why a person feels that they're not in control, and that has to be identified too. But usually, I think this idea of making a list of what I can and can't control is a good place to start.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Candace, Phil, Olga, and Laura. Candace.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And Brian, thank you very much for your presentation. It was fascinating. I'm going to skip my first question because once we started talking about time, I went into a different place. So my question to you is relevant to the concept of time that you discussed. So you stated quite a few times that time is a resource and how it can be utilized in therapy or processing. And here's my question. Is time a primary component or catalyst that drives behavior, or is it a secondary component that is part and parcel of the kind of logarithmic sequential processing of issues or problematic maladaptive behaviors? So is it, I guess it boils down to primariness. Is it primary or just a consequence of how we process? Does that make sense?
I think it does. That's a fascinating question. That's a big question. I'll try to answer it, and hopefully it will make some sense to you. Not that because it may not make much sense to me, but I'll try anyways. So because the way I look at it is, when we talk about time, we're talking about two types of time. We're talking about what we might call an objective, measurable, scientific type of time. And that has to do with our bodily response to the environment. It has to do how we grow, with how we intake food and nutrients. And so, that type of, what we might call it natural time, for lack of a better term. And that type of time does impact the second type of time, which I might call subjective time. And subjective time really moves at its own rate. Subjective time, it has to do with a person's view of the world, and it's not necessarily, you cannot use, because it's subjective, you cannot use scientific instruments to measure it. But so basically what you have in the human individual is you have both types of time. What I mean, you use the word primary time, secondary, I might say natural time versus subjective time, but they're very much interrelated, of course. And the question, becomes, when you're treating someone, how can you disentangle these two types of time? So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's it certainly led me to make that distinction, what I think is a very important distinction.
Excellent question, Candace. Thank you very much. Next up is Phil, Olga, and Laura. Phil.
Yeah, I have a question. I was curious when you brought up that when psychologists were surprised that there was a realm of free-floating, I think was ideas that couldn't find an attachment to some kind of functionality, right? And of course, psychologists are interested in a sense, I guess, re-engaging a person who's sick in some sense back to a functional world. But I wonder whether that's not also this sort of free attaching ideas. I call them radical ideas. I wonder how that affects creativity, because I have a curious, well, not curious, I actually find this quote very interesting by Beethoven. Beethoven actually said this: music is the one incorporeal entrance into a higher world of knowledge which comprehends mankind, but which mankind cannot understand. I'm particularly curious about the second which mankind cannot understand. What does mankind not understand? Music itself as the path into this entrance? Is it the higher understanding, higher knowledge that mankind cannot understand? Or is it himself, humanity himself? He actually can't even understand himself, or all of these. So all of these would create a kind of chord of music. And I just wonder whether that acknowledgement that there are some ways to the path of a higher understanding that we cannot understand, whether it's all combination of just one of those, whether that isn't a creative force that allow us to move into the unknown, because music allows us to, in a sense, at least a pathway maybe to that higher knowledge. So how will you differentiate, and perhaps, because I think of that as this sort of free-floating ideas as a kind of inhibition, because we know that the nerves are both attaching, letting information pass, and also inhibiting. I wonder if that inhibiting is not something that, in a sense, certain creative individual inhibit functionality to a degree that they could have still this free range, this sort of the lake of ideas to, in a sense, move to a higher understanding.
Okay, that's again, that's a big question. So this is just maybe more of a not to answer the question, because it's kind of a big question, as I said, but just sort of a response. The way I look at it, the way the human mind operates, is that sometimes it's either, it can be very rigid, a mental process, and it can be overly organized. You might see this, to use a clinical example, people with OCD or something, or hoarding or something. But then also the mind can be very flexible, not disorganized, but unorganized. And ideally, it's sort of that in-between area, not very rigid, not overly flexible, but somewhere in between, that usually is where we want to be functioning and operating as people. And I think creativity probably arises when we're in that in-between area. When we're certainly, it won't arise if we're too rigid in our thinking, but it won't arise if we're too flexible, because then things can become disorganized. So the idea is that perfect window of creativity. And so the you know, that's an abstract way to put it, but the challenge is, how do we get there? How do we encourage a person to not be overly rigid in their thinking, but also not to be too flexible in their thinking? So I don't know if that
Brian, let me try to address. I'm a big fan of Beethoven, so and I've read a lot of what Beethoven has written, and I've listened to a lot. So what Beethoven is talking about is that there is a lot more to the human psyche than what we have captured in words. And what music does at its best, and what a great musician does at their best, is to make some of that experientially available to you through their music, even when the musician himself doesn't have words for it. Okay, that's what he's talking about. Now, the point about structure and trying to grasp these things which are kind of edge of your consciousness, you can see it in Beethoven's own work. You know, the Morgan Library over here has Beethoven's manuscripts. They are all scratched up, and so there is a lot of iterative work of trying to capture this. It's not a process of saying, okay, I'm just going to, you know, intuit at something, but there's a way of going back and forth between intuition and structuring it in some way. Of course, this is being structured in notes, but it's still a structure. So there is a back and forth going and remaining open to the greatest possibilities that you can see at the edge of your consciousness, using your intuition, your unconscious, your subconscious, yourself, whatever terminology you want to use it for that. At the same time, using the best capacity to structure that you have in order to make it something more definite. It will never capture everything that can be captured, but it will hopefully point yourself and people in the direction in which you need to look so that you can get more. And music, I think, is kind of, I mean, I love music, so maybe I'm biased, but music actually has captured historically, or let me just broaden it to make it universal. Artists, great artists usually do that, whether it is in music, whether it is in visual arts, or it is in literature. But Phil, your questions are getting better and better with every meetup. This is incredible. Thank you, Phil. Next up is Olga, followed by Laura. Olga.
Okay. Hi, thank you very much. It's a great talk. And I have actually two questions, but maybe I ask first one and then maybe later, maybe now the second one. And why I'm asking this question, I'm going also to give a talk at the conference in Europe soon, and it will be dedicated to the future, to the notions of future. And as you probably hear right now, where I am from, that I am from the Soviet Union, and in Soviet bloc, there was, the whole society was concentrated mostly on the future, not on the past or the present. And now we see in the whole world, it's kind of also this concentration on the future, on solving all problems in the future with green energy, for example, or with something else, but we just put into the future, and we're more concentrated, as you said, on the future than on the past. But my question is, what do you personally think when this idea of the future was born? When Greeks, or with revelation in New Testament, or it's earlier or it's later, when it was developed, and why it has that much importance in our time?
Okay. Thank you for that question. So when was the notion of the future invented? Well, I think at least in, I don't like to say the West because it's kind of a vague term, but certainly by the late 1700s, you had some writers who started to write about actually how to improve society. And they actually were, some of the writings would become seeds for later on in the 1800s, the socialist communist movement, actually, how to reorganize political economic structures of society to improve society. And by the early 1800s, you had more and more people started to think that because society was changing so fast because of the Industrial Revolution, because of new political conceptions of man, that people were very optimistic. And there was this idea that we can radically change our society, that we can radically re-engineer society. And so I would say, to answer your question, by the late 1700s, early 1800s, the notion of the future was born. But it was not necessarily widespread among the masses. That probably did not happen until maybe the mid 1800s, late 1800s. This idea of modernity developed. That modernity actually is very interesting. It comes from the Latin modo, which means just now. And the idea is that you can never catch up because it's now is always now. And then that's the strange thing about the future. It's a very unsettling concept because it's constantly changing. So, just as I said, to give some historical context, I think we have to ask, why did we invent the future? And I think people often say, oh, you can trace it back to the Judeo-Christian notion of alpha, omega, the beginning and the end. But I think really the way we think of the future is only 2 or 3 centuries old. And it had to do with very rapid technological, economic changes and a sort of utopian view. So, in the Middle Ages, the idea is that you had to wait for utopia. You had to die to go to heaven for utopia. But in the modern, postmodern world, the idea is that utopia is now or in the immediate future. And I think if you look at this from the angle of literature, we need to ask ourselves, when did science fiction first occur, or as a genre? When did science fiction, because science fiction really often is about the future. It's about how technology has changed us, has changed our dreams and aspirations. And I'm not a literature expert, but I doubt you're going to find science fiction writings before the mid 1800s. And so that's just science fiction art always symbolizes what's going on in society. So I would just sort of throw that out there, that's a good indication. When was science fiction invented as a genre?
Yeah, that's excellent. I always appreciate kind of going back to the history to see where those notions came. And clearly it's the Industrial Revolution and dramatic transformation of life, because before that, life of a grandchild was not that different from life of a grandfather. It was all the same. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the notion of future in this modern time is in the Western society is mostly individuals projecting their own futures and then getting together as kind of, at business level, at various levels, and projecting the future, and all the various conceptions of future competing against one another and kind of working together. So in that sense, I don't think the Soviet bloc ever learned to think about the future. They just pretended to think about the future so they could take away everybody's present, something like that. But it's a very different kind of notion of kind of central that, okay, only these people are going to plan everything from everybody, which is very different kind of thinking than what James is talking about, where future is something which is, is a core capacity of each individual person to project their own future and then cooperating with one another to work together in kind of narratization, which is a far more complex pattern. Folks, you're welcome to ask second questions, but I'm going to give first priority to people who have not asked the question this before. So it's going to be Laura, Dave, Candace, and Phil, and then Olga. Laura.
Hi, okay. I want to go back to something you said about the brain healing itself. So I was curious. So if the brain gets damaged, let's say, and loses capacity to speak for some, or it loses its capacity to remember something short term. And so how does it go? What if it can't heal itself? Are there ways that somebody externally can work with that to help heal the brain? What happens in that case? If the brain can't heal itself, can the psychotherapist, analyst help heal the brain? Are there known therapies to do that? What happens to that person if they lose those capabilities?
Thank you, Laura.
So, I'm not a neuro scientist or a neurotherapist, but I would say I think it really depends on the type of injury. It depends on the type of trauma. It also depends on how old the person was when they had the brain injury. And it also depends on what part of the brain was injured. So, they're really, it's really a case by case type of issue. Again, it's not really my field. I can't speak to it specifically. I do know that they have developed pretty sophisticated programs of rehab that do help people with TBI or traumatic brain injury recover. And again, it depends. Certain things right now with dementia, it's very difficult. We don't really know a lot about it, but depending on the different types of dementia, it doesn't, at this point in time, it doesn't seem like we can repair the brain. But again, there are certain types of injuries where under the right type of program of rehab, we can help people.
Thank you. And I want to remind everybody that this is an educational program. Each individual case is amazingly complex, and that can only be handled in a professional setting. And we don't do that here. So this is kind of a general understanding of things. This is educational. All right. Next up is going to be Dave, Candace, Phil, and Olga. Dave.
Brian, wonderful presentation. Shrikant, if I could, I'd like to say a little bit about music to address Phil's question from Beethoven about—
Just short, though. Go ahead.
Yeah, about people not being understanding, but to enjoy. I've sung some major works that I swear the composer wrote just to get to one chord. And because everybody's have heard of, keys and, loud and soft, this, that, and the other, but I would analogize it to walking up a path on a beautiful day and coming to a clearing and seeing the distance a beautiful waterfall, and the entire experience builds to a certain climax, and then you come back down the mountain. To me, music is the same way. All these sounds are occurring and you don't understand what's going on, but you can feel a mood, You may even understand what he's writing about. But yeah, I think we all love music. But thanks. But like I say, just want to get off that question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great observation, Dave. Next up is going to be Candace, Phil, and Olga. Candace.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Brian, I'm still kind of tossing around the idea of time relative to what you had shared with us. And I'm wondering if time can be both an effective tool and, as you said, an organizing framework for analysis, but can it also maybe be a constrictor for organizing any kind of framework? So I see how we can build, how it can be a positive. I see how we change through time. I see the different platforms that you laid out for time. But I wonder if it can also be a hindrance, if it can constrict the processes that we're going through.
Yes, most definitely. To answer your question, most definitely. So, so with the feature of consciousness, narratization. So often narratization has a positive effect because it allows us to look at the past, to learn lessons, and also to look at how does the present fit into my life, what's going to happen in the future, what are the different routes I could take, the different paths to go down. So that's a benefit. But it can also cause problems for people, especially if there is something traumatic that happened in the past. We get stuck on the past, or we learned a lesson from the past, what not to do, but we have overlearned it. We've internalized it to the point where it does constrict and restrict our behavior. And then sometimes, as I mentioned before, with anxiety, people, the reason why many people develop anxiety is because that tool of narratization is in overdrive. We're thinking of too many things that might go wrong in the future. So this sort of as if mentality overtakes us. And so, yes, I'm not sure if that answers directly your question, but yes, time, because it is part of the all these features of conscious interiority, most definitely can be a sort of a maladaptation.
Wonderful. Next up is Phil, followed by Olga, and then we'll wrap up. Phil.
Yeah, I wonder whether what I would call, I mentioned creativity. I wonder whether creativity is not offering resistance to the over quantization of objectivity, because when we think about writing, we think about Gilgamesh, we think about the Iliad and so forth, and Shakespeare and so forth. But in fact, writing was developed in Sumeria about quantities. Harry owes me 2 bushels of grain and so forth, right? And then we're stuck with writing, and then the creative artist said, well, there is a difference between quantitative measurements and qualitative. And we want to resist the shadow of quantity covering over the quality of what existence is. Okay, think about time. Time we think of, like the quantity of dividing time of more and more micro units. Actually, that was developed in the marketing structure, for instance, in Venice. When we think about, even when Galileo used a telescope, he didn't look at the moons of Jupiter first. He was an inventor that looked at the ships coming, and that in a way, if he could see the ship coming 2 hours earlier, the market has an advantage. And so the quantitative time leads from quantitative measurement leads from Sumeria to Venice, to the Dutch trading company, to modern capitalism, right? And that over dividing of time has restricted us. So now we are all trapped in this sort of super measurement. So even when you run the Olympics, 100 milliseconds is what you're timed by. It used to be 1/10 of a second, and all that sort of stuff. So I wonder whether creativity as living in this constricted world, but finds a way to resist, in a sense, and inhibit quantitative measuring to a degree to expose the quality that we need to experience as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it goes back to what I said before. There's sort of a distinction between quantitative time and more qualitative, subjective time. And I think that I don't know. I can't think right now on exactly how to maintain to sort of to guard the value of a qualitative subjective time, I might say. But certainly that's something to think about, because what happens is, I think what you seem to be saying is, we get wrapped up, we become sort of, to use a cliche, cogs in the machine of economic production, of having basically to dance to the tune of other people, whether they're big organizations, governments, economic entities, and our own subjective experience of the world in temporal terms becomes basically eroded, maybe even erased. And this really, there are some practical things to do, I suppose, to meditate and to think about one's own life experiences and build our own very individualized, personalized self-narratization, our own timeline, as a way to escape, we might say, from this over-quantified, super measured view of the passage of time.
I want to plug our meetup at 5 o'clock at this point, because this is exactly the question that the meetup is about. It is a question of dance between digitization or quantification or measurement on one hand, and free-flowing expression and exploration on the other. It is the dance between exploitation of the quantification that you have already achieved and exploration of further connections. It is the dance between the written, which is specific, objective, out there, and the spoken, the conversational about the written, which adds interpretation, levels of interpretation, capturing depths of meanings, things that we may have escaped, which we may not have captured. And how do you achieve this dance between the written and the oral, between the digitized and interpretation, between the conscious and the unconscious, between the figure and the ground, in order to grow? Do not underestimate the power of the conscious, the digitized, the written, the specific, the structure, because that is what holding us together. We are able to talk over the Zoom, all the technology, all the computers, everything depends on that. We need that desperately. We can't have a large civilization without that, including the accounting part. It's needed. The laws, they're all needed. At the same time, the freedom of the individual to think as widely, as deeply, get into things which have not been captured yet, is the thing that is going to produce the next level of integration, which is going to make possible, for example, the amount of incredible prosperity that the industrial civilization has produced is giving us the leisure today to be sitting so far apart from each other, talking about topics like that. And I am deeply grateful for it. And that's why, so we can't underestimate that. At the same time, of course, we can't underestimate the creative. And how do you work on this dance? And how does that dance work over time? How did it work in the oral society? How did it work in the scribal society when writing came? How did it change when print came? How did it change in the television era? What is happening to it now? doing that all over time. That's what we're going to be talking about, the work of Walter Ong, and language as how it transforms over there. So another great question, Phil, but looking forward to continuing this discussion. Next up is going to be Mike. Mike, go ahead.
The world of physics has always dealt with time. And in particular, Roger Penrose wrote two voluminous treatises, one of them called Shadow of the Mind, and the other one called The Emperor's New Mind. And in that book, he brought in the concept of entropy, where ants and plants and humans take in energy directly or indirectly from the sun at very low entropy and put it out at even lower entropy, and in the process build up a violation of chaos and increase their and get an organization of their own mind. And also he reduces the concept of how we perceive time into and how anything perceives time into a concept of multiples of an elementary thing called Planck time. Now we can say that that's heartbeats or the natural alpha waves, beta waves, gamma waves of the sun, just like a computer doesn't actually measure time, it counts events. So now from that, he derived the same kind of the same things you're talking about, and provided some in deference to Phil, tried to quantize all of these things rather than qualitatively arrived at these things. Do you think that our concept of passage of time relies to these kinds of multiple things, like tied to the heartbeat, the distance of the heartbeat and circadian rhythms of the sun and that sort of thing, to how we perceive time and how entropy measures into how we increase organization of the mind? And I'll yield the balance of my time, and I hope you can give me some sort of answer, because even though I talk like I'm authoritative in these, I barely understand Penrose, or you for that matter, Brian. And of course, Shrikant, I don't understand at all.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so I'm Mike, thank you for that question. I mean, that's a real, you're looking at these issues from a very philosophical point of view with some physics thrown in. And I'm not sure if I can say anything really useful in response. I mean, time, maybe someone can correct me, but time is one of these things that in many ways, time is a human invention. When physicists talk about time, it seems to me they're actually talking about something quite different. I think I've always wondered if there is something outside of time or beyond time, and to what degree, as I said, is time something invented by the human mind. So there's not really much I could say beyond that. But like I said, these are very entertaining, deep philosophical questions.
Wonderful. Next up is Olga, and then we'll wrap up. Olga, go ahead.
Okay.
Try to keep it short so we can just a couple of minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. My second question is about you. One of the conclusions after your talk could be like that there are two scales: one biological evolutionary scale that applies to the body, and other scale that mostly cultural, not also partly evolutionary, but mostly cultural, that applies to the mind. Could you say that today we get to this point of so much disbalance that anxiety in society raising and raising? And I, for example, read about not only all the people who cannot get, no, who get very anxious, but also school children who cannot adapt to what is going on, and really more and more children go to like psychotherapy or even serious psychiatric treatment. So could you tell something about this disbalance? What do you think about it?
Well, I do think that if you look at history, especially history of the last century or two, I think what happened is things, because of scientific discoveries, because of technological inventions that led to more wealth, actually. It put more pressure on people to work harder, actually. I think that history is really moving fast. It's accelerating. And I think this acceleration probably started maybe in the 1700s, depending on what you look at. But now we're at a point where clearly there's no going back. And so from a practical clinical point of view, the question is all this acceleration a good thing? And I think that, you know, if you look at World War I, for example, I mean, you know, we can look at the specific reasons why the European nations and America went to war, but some people have said by the late 1800s, something like World War I or even World War II had been set up because the changes for the average person from an economic, political, technological point of view were so fast that social order just broke down, and it was inevitable that someone like Hitler would come to power because people needed reassurance because things are just moving too fast. And so I think there's a precedent for what we're seeing today. And I don't want to talk about politics and economic. I don't want to speculate too much. This is just more of an intuition, a gut feeling I have that when societies are moving too fast, you're going to see, not surprisingly, more disruption. And so the challenge becomes how can we still live in an accelerated history, but calm people, not lose our minds? How can we decrease anxiety? And of course, I don't have any answers off the top of my head for that. But I guess this is just more of a response rather than an answer to what you had to say. But I definitely, I mean, I see it in my own lifetime. I thought that at this age I would be more calm, but actually when I look around and I watch the news, there are so many reasons to become anxious, to become worried, to become upset. And I don't think in the long term that is good for any society.
Wonderful. All right, Brian, thank you very much. This was fantastic. I think this series is going really well. And I think the interactivity, I think, helps because it keeps, you know, make sure that it's far more engaging for people. And great questions, everybody. So thank you so much. I think the questions add a significant level of value. You know, they come from everywhere, you know, kind of from physics, from psychology, from Tao Te Ching, and they all from you know, planning of the future. So just great level of questions. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions. Bye now.
I again recommend the 5 o'clock meetup. It's really special. Randy Lump spent like 50 years with Walter Ong. So and that idea of what language is and how do we manage to keep things specific and quantifiable and creative. So how do we engage both our creative faculties and analytical faculties all the time and build them on one another instead of having them fight one another. There is a natural fight between them, and you kind of have to manage it. And how do you manage it effectively? Not only at a personal level, but at an interpersonal level. Not only at an interpersonal level, but at a societal level. And that's the scale at which this Walter Ong thinks. That's his entire life's work. And looking at the record of this, kind of going all the way back, just like Julian Jaynes, he goes all the way back to the beginning of writing and before that, in order to study these issues. So I look forward to seeing you there. Bye, everybody.